this email? What does it mean?
Communication is the imparting or exchanging of information or
The
news.
single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place.
Conversation is the oral exchange of sentiments, observations, opinions, or ideas.
Forbes Books Radio presents The Conversation with Clinton M. Padgett.
Today's guest helps leaders solve one of the most pressing challenges in modern work: how to perform at a high level without burning out the very people responsible for the results. Paula Davis is a globally recognized advisor and leadership strategist on burnout prevention, workplace stress, and team resilience. She's the founder of the Stress and Resilience Institute, where for more than 15 years she's helped leaders implement what she calls TNTs, tiny noticeable things, which I love, by the way, that create stronger teams and more sustainable performance. Paula's path to this work is compelling. She began her career as a lawyer, which doesn't happen every day, I think, left practice after 7 years and earned a master's degree in applied positive psychology from the University of Pennsylvania. She went on to serve on the Penn faculty that trained resilience skills to more than 40,000 soldiers, that's a big number, and their families as part of the Army's comprehensive soldier and family fitness program. This work has been tested in environments where pressure is, in fact, real. She's the author of Beating Burnout at Work and her newest book, Lead Well: 5 Mindsets to Engage, Retain, and Inspire Your Team. Both have been selected as must-reads by the Next Big Idea Club, which is curated by Adam Grant, Susan Cain, Malcolm Gladwell, and Daniel Pink. You probably have heard those names. And Lead Well was named one of the top 11 leadership books for 2025. Wow, I'm impressed, Paula. Thanks so much and welcome to the conversation.
Thank you, Clint. I'm so excited to chat with you.
So I like to kick this off with the same question to everybody. I like to think that everybody comes on my podcast as a superhero, and all superheroes have an origin or a backstory. So what is yours? I hear that it involves a hog barn, just somewhere in there.
Oh, we're going way back. We're going to go. I was going to start with the law practice, but no, we'll go way back. No, I come from a very much an entrepreneurial family, and it's not just my nuclear family, my parents and my brother. We've all started businesses. My parents, as I mentioned in the beginning of the book, started a business in the early 1980s that was a plastic injection molding company, and it started as my dad's side hustle. And he ended up growing it into a 3-shift, I think at the peak, he had 40 plus employees. And then they sold the business successfully in the late 1990s. But that entrepreneurial way of being was just how I grew up. And so leading businesses, being in businesses, figuring out how businesses run, just kind of having my hands in all of that has always been something that's been really appealing to me. So then it would make total sense that I would, go to law school. But I actually went to law school thinking that I would be more of a corporate attorney helping small business owners, actually. And it just didn't turn out that way in the early stages and ended up going into commercial real estate. But yeah, no, so that's, the small business owner sort of mentality is really just where my roots start.
And then what jumped you to Penn?
So I actually burned out during what became the last year of my law practice. So all these threads are tying through now. So I had been practicing for about 6 years, and I started to notice that like my own stress response was off. The quantity and volume of work that I had, because I had switched from a law firm role to in-house counsel. So I was actually in a large organization that was growing very, very quickly. And, taking on that new role was really everything that came with it, and sort of shifting from those legal environments really brought a lot of stress, I think, in a way that I misunderstood or certainly misjudged. And so I didn't have a language to really talk about what I was experiencing or feeling, and I just knew something was off. I tried to just kind of put my head down and kind of work through it. And that didn't work. And then over time, my symptoms started to get worse. So ultimately, and this is over a year-long period of trying to figure out what was going on, figure out, do I want to stay in the law? Do I want to stay at the organization that I was in? Talking to a coach, ended up getting panic attacks almost every day. So, a ton of anxiety and other things were happening. The coach who I ended up hiring just to kind of try and figure out like next steps career-wise had just finished the applied positive psychology program at the University of Pennsylvania. And so I she said that, and I was like, what is that? Like, what is that program? Because my undergrad is in psychology, and I've always loved that area of science. And so she explained it to me, and I went, oh my gosh, I have to check this thing out, and I've got to figure this out. And it was a very, very new program. And so really, once I heard about that path, I never really turned back. And so applied to the program, got in, stopped my law practice in June of 2009, and started my master's degree in September of 2009. So I decided to make my mess my message. I wanted to go back and get some additional education so I could go back into initially what I thought the legal profession. That's expanded to really help people who are feeling a lot of stress and pressure not end up the way that I did.
So it kind of makes sense coming out of that burnout you were experiencing, that your first book would predominantly be about that.
Yep.
So what led you to write the new one, Lead Well?
Yeah. So the first book came out in 2021, and, obviously in the middle of the pandemic and, all of the things that were going on back in 2021. And for the arc of my career, but especially since the first book came out, I really have spent a concentrated amount of time with a lot of leaders and a lot of teams, just talking about what are they seeing as giving rise to burnout within their teams. How are they able to feel like they can lead during complex and uncertain times and all of that. And I realized the more groups that I talked to and the more leaders that I spent time with, they were really kind of frustrated and puzzled. I think they were starting to feel a lot of burnout themselves, but they were also kind of stuck thinking, like, how do I help my team through this? How do I help my team navigate this extraordinary complexity? As the pandemic eased and we started to come out of it, a lot of people were still really changed by what they experienced during that time period. And so a lot of things were happening. And I realized that leaders didn't really have a playbook. They didn't really have a language or vocabulary or a starting point or easy tools to not only help themselves, but also really help their teams be able to, kind of go through this process, go through the way that work was evolving in a healthy way, in a resilient way, and in a sustainable way.
So you mentioned, we barely touched on it in the first part about where you kind of grew up and your dad had his business. And I was referencing the hog barn, which I think is where he started, even though he ended up with a real facility with 3 shifts a day, et cetera. But he had this idea about extreme client service. And that really resonated with me, because I tend to be like that with clients as well. And I'm just curious, what is that, and how that really kind of influenced where you headed?
Yeah. So for him, and I always remember these different stories and instances, it wasn't just about him being able to deliver. So he created plastic injected molded parts for different organizations and for different groups. So I remember him saying, such and such company their line is going to shut down if they don't get a certain quantity of parts by X day, right? So he would go into the shop, he would open it up, even if it was just himself, he would start the machines, he would, do all of the process, he would create however many boxes or whatever count of parts were needed, and he would literally drive them to the, wherever the organization was, to make sure that their line didn't go down. So, it was always this service mentality. This is, this how can we help? I remember there were times where he was low material, and there were new sales folks who were working at the material resin companies who would drive the 2 bags when he was still small organization out to him so that he could continue to produce. And so it was just very much this lovely ecosystem that I witnessed that was just this constant kind of service mentality. What is it that I can do and that we can provide to make sure that you, my clients, are getting the best outcome possible?
And I think later in the book, there's somebody, I can't remember the name, but you talked to somebody and he was saying that there are certain clients you still need to have that high touch point with, but there's other times you have to step back and say, I'm at my daughter's recital or I'm at a graduation and I'm just not going to take the call, right? So there's a balance.
That and I think that's really important because, working with a lot of the organizations that I do and in the industries that I do, this notion of great client service can sometimes be taken to, unsustainable points and regions. But yeah, that's one of my favorite stories. I was a partner at a large law firm who I interviewed, and he was, I think, really drove the point home of talking about when I'm working with clients and we're working on sophisticated matters, I always like to make sure that they obviously know that I'm a point of contact or the point of contact, but they also know other members of my team because they need to see that there's this collective who is working to help them. And while you may call me first, I may hand you off to another person on my team. And it's also providing, valuable learning opportunities for the person who is, on the receiving end of that call. So yes, you're right. There does have to be a balance for sure.
I think the other thing that was surprising when I read that was you actually told the story of somebody, or maybe it was him telling a story, but it's basically where he was working late at night and this person sent an email saying this has been done. And he pointed out that you may have interrupted this person and then maybe unlike you, they shut their mind off at 5 o'clock about work and or doing something in their family, and you've interrupted them, and that's not a good thing. So I never thought about that. It was interesting.
I had never thought about it either, especially coming out of, 7 years of law practice where there is just such a, extreme focus on, this client service and what have you. And it is always, and it's really, I think, for high achievers, I think it is sort of a badge of honor when you can say, you see yourself sending emails at like midnight or 1 a.m, or you're responding to the boss, at all hours and things like that. But it was the first time when he said that I really paused as well and went, whoa, yeah, I guess I wouldn't necessarily, unless there was some crisis happening or, I was specifically instructed to, communicate at that particular point in time, that might be an interruption that wouldn't be looked on favorably. And so, yeah, that stuck with me too.
Yeah. I have somebody working with right now who I love her emails. At the bottom, it says, "This was sent when it was convenient for me. Please respond when it's convenient for you," which is, it's kind of band-aiding what we just talked about.
Yeah, no, that's great.
So you argue that burnout isn't just an individual struggle, but it's really a systemic culture influence problem. And why do leaders need to shift from a me focus to a we focus when it comes to well-being?
Yeah, I think so I've been in this conversation long enough, so I've seen how this has really kind of played out and where it has stalled. So that's really kind of the first entry point, but really starting to understand and think about burnout in a systemic way, meaning that there's work design pieces that promote burnout, and then there's the individual stuff. And I think what has happened as organizations have jumped into the well-being conversation, or some of these, whatever word you want to kind of put to it, we tend to still see burnout, or have thought about burnout historically, as an individual failing of stress management. You're just not doing it the right way, or you're just not, recovering the right way, or you just don't have, the right stress management strategies or what have you. And we keep trying to send the message, well-being strategies and wellness programs and things like that are good, they're valuable, and they're well-intentioned. They're just not necessarily the right set of strategies to fix something that, when you start to really understand and unwind kind of the upstream causes of it, they're not going to help fix things like unmanageable workloads and lack of recognition and not having enough flexibility and control and values misalignment, and the things that we know that really cause burnout. The things that really cause burnout are more of those structural, cultural work design pieces. And so a lot of my work has been trying to get leaders to see it's not that we're going to get rid of the individual conversation and the strategies and the things like that. They need those things, and that's really helpful, but we're not really going to advance the conversation until we also start looking at a lot of those upstream drivers and causes. And so it's a both and conversation, instead of, oftentimes what I hear is, individuals saying, there's nothing I can do because it's the work culture, and leaders saying, I have so much on my plate. What do you want me to do now? And, kind of each person pointing the finger at the other one, and nothing happens. So really seeing it as a collective, understanding that, there's team dynamics, leadership behaviors, and individual behaviors that all intertwine, and we have to address all of that if we're going to move forward.
I love the studies that you reference in the book. And the first one that comes to mind was the Deloitte 2023 Workplace Wellbeing Report, where more than 75% of executives think the well-being improved while 66% of the employees say it stayed the same or got worse. So how can team leaders bridge this gap?
It's so funny because as you know, I continue to review research and it marches on in different ways. There's still these same types of gaps that exist where I feel like the most senior leaders perceive things happening that really the frontline managers and other folks just are seeing a completely different story. And I think that it becomes, and why it's important for me to make sure that I'm in front of as senior level groups as possible so that they really understand the disconnect and, hopefully can promote some conversations within the organizations as well, because those gaps exist in a number of different ways and we have to figure out how to close them because we're not solving for anything when those types of gaps exist.
And you might think, how can you look at the same data of two different people and see different things? But if you have confirmation bias, then if you think everything's going well, you might see 5 pieces of data and pick the one that reinforces what you were thinking and ignore the other 4. So it's probably not surprising.
Well, no, and if you think things are going well for you, you think they're going well for everyone, or you're more likely to see like, oh, well, I'm fine and I'm managing my stress and all is good. And, so teams must be doing great. We're doing great things around here. And you're exactly right. So both of those pieces.
Another study showed that managers and spouses, by the way, have the greatest impact on people's mental health. But only about 40% of the managers feel capable of helping a company achieve its well-being goals, which seems like a big problem.
It is a big problem. So when you look at the research, it is extraordinarily clear how important leaders are to this conversation, to the motivation, to the psychological safety, to the well-being, to the burnout prevention. I mean, leaders are just so critical to this conversation, but they oftentimes aren't given the training, the education, the support, the resources to actually be able to do something. So a lot of them really want to do right by their teams. They just have no clue where to start. I mean, I think regardless of, industry or profession, whether you got an MBA, your law degree, you're a healthcare professional or what have you, you don't get a lot of leadership training necessarily in your academic area of study, but then you also certainly don't get the layer of psychology and, the underpinning of, human strategies and behavior and other things to really help you see like, what should I do here and where should I start, right? It's about strategy and making our numbers and quarterly profits and, all of the economic side, but there's a whole human side that needs to be developed. And we just oftentimes just don't have any sort of reference or framing or starting point.
Now, one of the things you said, though, was that one of the more effective ways to boost engagement is to have meaningful conversations with their team, and which I loved, of course, because this podcast is called The Conversation. Mm-hmm. And what makes a conversation meaningful? I'm assuming the meaningful is purposeful.
Yeah, it's talking about strengths, right? It's sitting down with someone and really understanding the impact that they're having on the team and within their corner of the world of work, and actually communicating that to them, and really having somebody be able to clearly walk away understanding what I did on this particular project led to this particular outcome, or our team is better off because I did A, B, and C, or what have you, and having that really be understood becomes critical. And then layering on, conversations about strengths, managers and leaders really being able to say, your curiosity here really, helped you ask the right question in this last project meeting, and that opened the door to a completely different way of us perceiving how we needed to, move forward, for example. And so it's the repetition, and I don't necessarily always call them meaningful conversations. I'll call them one-on-one conversations. Leaders with whom I've worked call them well-being check-ins, like lots of different names and phrases, but it's having these regular, and they don't have to be for a long period of time, 15, 20 minutes every other week or so, check-ins where you're delivering some of that feedback, where you're having, a back and forth conversation that maybe isn't necessarily related to something always work related, right? So I'm trying to get to know you and, kind of deepen that sense of trust. And so many people miss those opportunities, and we just think like, we've got our yearly review or we've got our quarterly, whatever. And we've got to make sure that we're adding in more of those moments of connection and meaning in a one-on-one way.
I think in today's environment where it is more about whether it's billable hours or just getting more done. People are so busy, and I work in project management, and I can make the argument that many companies overlaunch and this wish and a prayer that we'll get it all done. And if I just push people hard enough, it'll happen. But so then what the side effect of that is that people are so busy. If I see you in the hallway, I really hope you don't ask me any questions, because I got other things. I'm trying to get to this meeting, and the last thing I want to do is have a conversation and talk about personal things. But in reality, if I can't convert you from an email address to which I don't feel a connection to a human being that is on the same team with me, we're going to struggle as a team.
We're going to hugely struggle as a team. And, when we go back to thinking about those upstream drivers or causes of burnout, the biggest one that I have seen by far and away across industry, certainly over the last 5, 6, 7 years, is having an unmanageable workload. It's not high workload. So high workload is good. High workload is stressful, but it operates on our system in a little bit of a different way. It's unmanageable, right? I am like drinking from a fire hose constantly. I'm trying to get my arms around everything. I'm treading water, and at any moment I feel like I might sink. It's that kind of feeling. And when we are in that, and we have far too many meetings in our world of work, and that could be a whole conversation in and of itself, but it's kind of a subgroup or a subcategory or a factor in the unmanageable workload conversation. And so when you think about, if I am drinking from the fire hose kind of level busy, it's going to be harder for me to foster a good, solid community, a cohesive community within the team. It's going to be harder for me to notice moments when people are doing a really great job and to say the thank yous and the things and the recognition and appreciation and other things that we have to do. So the factors that drive burnout all are kind of interconnected and feed, off each other. And it's oftentimes driven by that sense of unmanageable workload. Not always, but it's a huge factor.
And there's almost a hidden thing there as well, in that if I'm working 60, 80 hours a week, and you're only doing 60, why are you talking to me? I'm working more than you. So, come back to me when you actually put some effort in is almost the feeling. And that's probably not going to foster goodwill either.
No, and I also see, a different angle to that. Oftentimes leaders will tell me, they're like, we're underwater as a team, and we just have like way too much work for a variety of different reasons. And leaders oftentimes will try and take that extra work off of team members' plates and put it on theirs. And so now they're already probably overloaded, and they're adding even more overload to the overload. And I think that's part of the reason why we're seeing, leaders generally as a cohort experiencing elevated and higher rates of burnout as well.
So there was a matrix in the book kind of talking about this a little bit. It was called People Plus Performance, which I really loved. And can you expand on what that was? Because there's also a business case. If somebody says, well, that's work, but there was a huge business case to be made if we were able to pull this off.
Yeah, it's so funny because I hear that oftentimes when I'm delving into the, how do you motivate teams, the psychological safety, some of these concepts which, do require leaders. It doesn't have to be hard things, but you got to do something, right? Leadership is a verb. And I will get a lot of pushback. And I think it's oftentimes stemming from the exhaustion piece of the overload of work part. Be like, like you're telling me I have to do something additional. So what I'm already trying to do. And it's like, yes, you're a leader, right? It's a set of behaviors. You have to actively do things. But I loved coming across this quadrant and this particular piece of research because the research categorized organizations that were studied into performance focused. So these companies outperformed in the financial results dimension. They had a separate category for people-focused. So those were the companies who outperformed on the human capital dimensions of work. They had the typical performers, which was the vast majority of the companies that they looked at that showed no distinct patterns or didn't stand out in either of those dimensions. And then they had about 9% of companies were companies that they called people and performance-focused, where they really excelled on both sides of the equation, the financial metrics and the people side. And 9%, not a lot of organizations, right? The typical performers were 55% of the group. So most companies are not falling in that category where they're excelling on both sides. Yeah, and the business case that came from it, I mean, what they noticed, in terms of the decade leading up to the pandemic, what they noticed in the years following the pandemic in terms of, profits and revenue and a whole host of metrics, that those blended people and performance focused companies just blew every other type on that quadrant really out of the water. And I think it's interesting, and I put it in the book because when I talk about this, sometimes I will get pushback, especially from the organizations that are excelling on the financial side of the equation. It's like, what do you want us to do, right? We got a lot of money coming in. People are happy. They're getting paid well. Really, what's the problem? And the study made a point of saying that what is oftentimes missed by those folks is that when you do hit a rough patch, you do hit something goes wrong or there's an issue within the organization, oftentimes when you don't have that people side also elevated, you tend to have a bumpier ride throughout those hurdles and issues and complexities and setbacks. And so I just think with the way the world is operating right now in terms of how complex it is and how uncertain it is, you really have to start to pay attention to that people side as well in order to navigate the landscape right now. But yeah, it's a fascinating study. I try and include it whenever I can when I'm trying to make the case about the business case associated with these things.
That's important because people see the ROI and that's what they want to talk about. And you have to say, yeah, it's a cost, but there's a huge benefit that more than outweighs the cost. So
yeah.
You mentioned, I like the number 6 apparently, because you have 6 a couple places in the book. And the one was the core 6 drivers of chronic stress and disengagement that teams need to watch out for. What are those, or if there's more than, if there's like 1 or 2 that are most important, what are they?
Yeah. So the first one I've mentioned is the unmanageable workload. So that's a big one. The second one is lack of recognition. So all of these categories have a lot of like nuance and subcategories associated with them. So lack of recognition isn't just, I don't hear thank you a lot. That's part of it. But it's that I also fail to see the positive impact that my work is having within the organization or on the team. I hear from people that they will say, man, I feel like I'm working at a certain level, but my title just doesn't match. I don't feel like I'm getting invited to the important calls or pitches or meetings or projects that are really visible within the organization. So all of that is lack of recognition. Unfairness is the third one, which is perceived favoritism. So it's not what I do, it's who you know. That's how I get promoted around here. That's, how people, start to make their names and careers around here. It's lack of transparency. A lot of closed door meetings. There seem to be whispers among different groups and no one's saying anything about like what's really happening or how it's going to impact my work. And I think that's starting to increase with the AI component of work, right? Because I think there's a lot of whispers and closed door meetings happening in a lot of organizations right now about, is AI going to displace people? What percentage of people is it going to displace? Should we say something now? Maybe we don't know yet. So I think that's a big one. Lack of community is number 4. So I don't feel like I'm part of a supportive team. I don't have a lot of, workplace friendships. I don't feel like my leader has my back. Values misalignment is a 5th one, and that's one that I'm hearing with more frequency. So I value and want certain things about work and from my work, and my organization's values are different from my values. And so that mismatch can be stressful over time. And then the last one is lack of autonomy. So that lack of perceived flexibility and control. And it's not necessarily just in terms of where or when I work, but it is, how my social networks expand. Do I have a lot of decision latitude in my work? Do I have creativity in terms of how I can approach what I'm working on? So all of those things go into flexibility and control. So those are the core 6. Those are the big 6 drivers. I would say I have gotten to the point where I ask most groups if they have a 7th or an 8th, or would they add anything to the list? And the thing that I'm hearing most commonly is uncertainty. So almost adding like a little asterisk number 7, uncertainty, as another potential driver.
You mentioned a couple times so far unmanageable workload, and I'm wondering, how do you distinguish between that and high workload? What's really the difference?
Yeah, so high workload, you got a lot that you're working on, you have a lot on your plate, but you perceive that you have the right resources or enough resources to manage that, meaning I've got a supportive leader. I have really great teammates and colleagues who I know I can rely on. We have really good procedures and processes and systems in place. I can find the information that I need quickly. There's a whole host of different types of things that can help with that. And so it's stressful, but it's the type of stress that's called a challenge demand, meaning that I got a lot of work. It makes me feel like I'm kind of wanted around here and I'm doing a good job. And, there's motivational aspects to that. Unmanageable workload is, as I described, where you feel like you're drinking from a fire hose. You've got stuff coming at you. I don't understand what I'm supposed to be doing. What should I do first? I'm trying to get my arms around it. I feel like I'm treading water and at any moment I might sink. That almost panicked feeling of the fact that I can never get ahead, I can never get it all done, is what's called a hindrance demand, meaning that I don't really derive a lot of benefit from being in this state, and it's sending me in a different path when it comes to my stress.
It makes sense to me. I was on a project for about 4 years at a client, and team was great. I loved the people. I loved working on it, but there was so much that I would have to swim as hard as I could just to barely keep up. And if I ever said, let me just take a breath, then I was behind again. I have to swim even harder to catch back up. It's just, I don't think I ever did catch up.
No, and I don't think a lot of people do. I mean, you have to, this was the unmanageable, the workload sustainability chapter in the book was one of the hardest chapters I've ever written about anything, in part because as I dug into it more, there was just more and more and more. And it's this huge sort of layered big ball of stuff that takes a lot of time. And I can see how in organizations of all sizes, no one really wants to take the time to sift through and go like, why did we open this project 5 years ago? Why is it still open? Why can't we have enough resources at this? Are we really putting a Band-Aid on this particular, initiative? Because it's not really solving any sort of true problem. I don't know. Let's just let it go. I mean, there's all of these decisions and non-decisions happen over the course of many, many years to a point where you get into this very thick weeds. Again, you're kind of like in the weeds. And at some point, somebody or a group of people at a certain level just has to be able to start to kind of sift through that and unwind it. And it's just a really, really hard thing to do.
Yeah. Let's talk about the ABCs for a minute. So you have autonomy, belonging, and challenge, and you describe them as essential nutrients. Why are those three so important?
So these three form the basis of something called our intrinsic motivation. It's a theory called self-determination theory. So it's a research-based term. A good 30, 40 years of research behind the fact showing that when we get a little bit of dose of each of these three pieces, when we get a little bit of dose of some challenge or some flexibility and control in our work, when we feel like we are showing up to a team where we belong, where we matter, where we know that our talents are being utilized, and when we are challenged, when we aren't just functionally being repetitious about our work, but we're being pushed to achieve things that are indicative of goals that matter to us. When we have that constellation, those three pieces, so much research showing about how it increases organizational commitment. It lowers depression, burnout, anxiety, increases organizational buy-in, increases engagement. Like it's such a foundational need to feel like I'm coming to work because I want to be here and I want to do this great work versus I'm being told to do it or what have you. So that intrinsic motivation starts to blossom when we get these three needs met.
I'm wondering, keeping talking about those, in a hybrid environment or a fully remote environment, is there like tension between the autonomy and the belonging piece, the freedom and the connection? And does that create challenges?
Yes, I've noticed that certainly since the pandemic where everything got upended in terms of the predominant method of our work happened to be going into an office building and doing work. And when the pandemic hit, obviously dependent on profession, we had to figure out how to work in these alternative environments where people were fully remote or now largely hybrid. But you start to see that creep kind of back into more so in the office. And in a lot of instances, return to office mandates where we want you, you're required now and expected to be back in the office, 4 days a week, in some cases now 5 days a week. And so what you see is it's like trying to put toothpaste back in a bottle. Like you just can't do it because it's like, I know I can do this job fully remotely and I can do it well and we can have great success and meet our numbers. And now you're telling me I have to give up one of those huge sort of psychological benefits that is really important to me, that I really need in service of coming back into a physical office. And that's frustrating for people when they feel that erosion of autonomy. On the other hand, though, being in and amongst a group of people and in person and, riffing off of each other and having the water cooler conversations and building up that community is really, really important. And so there has been a consistent tension between the A and the B, certainly over, the last 5 or 6 years in a pronounced way.
Well, that concludes part 1 of my conversation with Paula Davis, founder and CEO of the Stress and Resilience Institute and author of Beating Burnout at Work. Coming up in part 2, Paula shares fascinating research that shows the best teams don't just align on strategy and execution, even their heart rates begin to sync up.
The study found that teams whose heart rate synchrony, I always say that word incorrectly, but when our heart rates start to get on a rhythm that kind of matches each other's, they found that teams where that happened had higher levels of trust, better decision-making, and other really strong positive team outcomes, which I thought was really, really cool. So like biologically wired, we're cohesive down to like the heart rate level in terms of how our team functions.
Thanks for listening to The Conversation. To find out more about Clint, go to clintonmpaget.com and pick up Clint's book, How Teams Triumph, Managing by Commitment, at Amazon. The Conversation with Clinton M. Paget is a production of Forbes Books.